June 7, 1942, the Crimean Peninsula. The earth shakes. Not a subtle vibration, but a violent tectonic event that registers on seismographs miles away. A sound tears through the air, so loud that it shatters windows in villages well behind the firing line. A projectile the size of a small tank screams into the sky, arcing higher than Mount Everest, reaching the stratosphere. Minutes later, it descends. It strikes a secret Soviet ammunition dump known as White Cliff. This dump is not just a warehouse. It is a fortress buried 30 meters underwater, encased in 10 meters of reinforced concrete. It was designed to be indestructible. It was designed to survive a nuclear blast before nuclear weapons even existed. But when the projectile hits, physics breaks. The shell punches through the water. It punches through 30 meters of solid earth. It punches through the concrete roof like a needle through paper. And then it detonates. The explosion is so massive that a mushroom cloud rises over the Bay of Severnaya. A ship anchored in the harbor is tossed onto dry land by the shockwave. The Soviets inside the bunker simply vanish. This was not an act of God. It was the work of a machine so comically large that it shouldn't have existed. It was the Schwerer Gustav, heavy Gustav, a gun that weighed 350 tons, a gun that required a city of 4,000 men just to operate, a gun so big it needed 2 parallel railway tracks to move. It remains to this day the largest weapon ever fired in anger in human history. But to understand this monster, we cannot start with the explosion. We have to start with the fear. Go back to the mid-1930s. Europe is holding its breath. The First World War is over, but the scars are fresh. France, terrified of another German invasion, decides to build a shield that can never be broken. They pour millions of tons of concrete and steel along their border with Germany. They build the Maginot Line. This was not just a wall. It was a subterranean civilization. It had underground railways, air-conditioned barracks, movie theaters, and automated machine gun turrets that popped out of the ground. The French engineers boasted that it was impervious to any known artillery. They claimed that the German army would break its teeth against these walls. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler looked at the maps and saw a problem. The Wehrmacht was built for speed, the Blitzkrieg, tanks, trucks, fast movement. But tanks are useless against a mountain of concrete. If Germany went to war, they would be stopped dead at the French border. The war would turn into another stalemate of trenches and mud, exactly like World War I. Hitler could not allow that. He needed a can opener. He needed a hammer big enough to smash the Maginot Line into dust. In 1936, Hitler traveled to the industrial heart of Germany, Essen. He visited the headquarters of the Krupp family. The Krupps were the arms dealers of kings. For 400 years, if there was a war in Europe, Krupp steel was killing people on both sides. Gustav Krupp, the patriarch of the family, welcomed the Führer. Hitler's request was simple but physically insane. He asked, what kind of weapon would it take to punch through 7 meters of reinforced concrete or 1 full meter of steel armor plate? The Krupp engineers ran the numbers. They looked at the ballistics tables. They looked at the structural limits of steel. They came back with an answer that sounded like science fiction. They told Hitler, Mein Führer, to generate that kind of kinetic energy, we cannot use a standard artillery shell. We need a shell that weighs 7 tons. It must be 80 centimeters wide. That is not a bullet. That is the size of a telephone booth. But the problem wasn't the shell. It was the gun needed to fire it. To throw a 7-ton object nearly 47 kilometers, the barrel would need to be 32 meters long. The recoil would be strong enough to destroy any suspension system ever invented. The engineers explained that such a gun would weigh over 1,000 tons. No road in the world could support it. The asphalt would crumble instantly. No bridge in Europe could hold it. The bridges would snap like twigs. It couldn't move on tank treads because the engine required to move it would be the size of a factory. The only way to move it was by rail, but a standard railway track couldn't handle the weight. The gun was so wide that it would tip over, so the engineers proposed a solution that had never been tried before. The gun would travel on 2 parallel sets of railway tracks. It would effectively be a rolling building, carried by 2 customized trains welded together. Hitler listened to the impossible specifications. The cost would be astronomical, over 7 million Reichsmarks. The steel required could build an entire fleet of panzer tanks. The manpower needed just to assemble it would be equal to a small army division. Any rational strategist would have said no. They would have built bombers instead. But Hitler didn't want a strategic weapon. He wanted a symbol. He wanted a weapon of terror. He wanted something that proved Aryan engineering could conquer the laws of physics. He looked at Gustav Krupp and gave the order. Build it. The project was codenamed. To honor the head of the company, they called it Schwerer Gustav. Back in the foundries of Essen, the nightmare began. The engineers had to figure out how to forge a barrel tube massive enough to hold a human being standing upright inside it. They had to invent new steel alloys that wouldn't melt under the explosive pressure of the propellant charges. They were building a monster, and like Dr. Frankenstein, they didn't stop to ask if they should build it. They only cared that they could. By 1939, the war had started. The Maginot Line was waiting. But the gun wasn't ready. The engineering challenges were proving to be even harder than predicted. The forging of the massive barrel was failing. Cracks were appearing in the steel. The German army bypassed the Maginot Line by going through the forest of the Ardennes, rendering the need for the gun theoretically obsolete. But the project didn't stop. The obsession had taken hold. The target changed. If they couldn't use it on the French forts, they would use it on something even stronger. They would use it to crack the most heavily fortified city in the history of warfare, the Soviet port of Sevastopol. The monster was coming, and the world had no idea what was about to hit it. In the industrial heart of Essen, the sky was permanently grey. Smoke poured from the chimneys of the Krupp factories day and night. Inside, thousands of workers were labouring on a secret project that consumed more steel than a battleship. They were building Device 672, but history would know it as the monster. The first challenge was the barrel. It is hard to comprehend the scale of it. A standard tank gun is maybe 3 or 4 meters long. The barrel of the Schwerer Gustav was 32.5 meters long. It was so long that you could lay a 10-story building inside it. Forging a single piece of steel this size was metallurgically impossible. If they cast it as one piece, it would crack under its own weight while cooling. So the Krupp engineers had to invent a new technique. They forged the barrel in 2 massive halves, using a special jacketed construction. The inner liner, the part that would actually touch the exploding shell, had to be rifled. Rifling spins the shell to make it fly straight, but cutting spiral grooves into a tube of hardened steel that is big enough for a man to crawl through required tooling that didn't exist. They had to build machines just to build the machine. Then came the carriage. How do you move a gun that weighs 350 tons? If you put it on wheels, the tires would explode. If you put it on tracks like a tank, the ground pressure would turn the soil into liquid mud, and the machine would sink until it was buried. The only answer was the railway. But the engineers hit another wall. A standard European railway track is 1.4 meters wide. If you put a 350-ton gun on a single track, the center of gravity would be so high that the first time the wind blew, or the first time the gun fired, it would tip over. The solution was a stroke of mad genius. They didn't use one train. They used 2. They designed a chassis that straddled 2 parallel railway tracks. The gun sat on top of 2 massive bogies running side by side. It had 80 wheels in total, 40 on the left track, 40 on the right. It moved like a giant crab. It was the widest vehicle ever built. It took up so much space that whenever the Gustav had to move, the German army had to build a completely new, custom-made dual railway line just for it. It couldn't just go to the front. The front had to be rebuilt to welcome the gun. By 1941, the weapon was taking shape. The cost was spiraling out of control. The final bill for the gun came to 7 million Reichsmarks. To put that into perspective, for the price of this single gun, Germany could have built 30 Tiger tanks, or 60 Panzer IVs. From a strategic point of view, it was a disaster. Hitler was trading an entire armored division for one giant tube. But dictators do not buy weapons for efficiency. They buy them for ego. And the Gustav was the ultimate expression of the Nazi ego. Big, terrifying, and utterly impractical. Finally, the day of the test arrived. The gun was hauled to the Rügenwald firing range on the coast of the Baltic Sea. Adolf Hitler arrived in his personal limousine to watch. Alfred Krupp, the son of Gustav, was there to host him. The order was given to fire. The firing sequence of the Schwerer Gustav was a slow, deliberate ritual. The shell alone weighed 7.1 tons, as much as a school bus. It had to be lifted by a dedicated crane and rammed into the breech by a hydraulic piston. Then came the propellant, not just one bag of powder, but massive silk bags of high explosive, stacked one after another, totaling 2,000 pounds of gunpowder. When the trigger was pulled, the effect was apocalyptic. The report was heard 50 kilometers away. The shockwave knocked the hats off the officers standing hundreds of meters back. The shell soared into the stratosphere, reaching an altitude of 30,000 feet, higher than most airplanes could fly. It stayed in the air for nearly 3 minutes. When it landed on the test target, a mock-up of a concrete bunker, it didn't just penetrate. It obliterated. The crater was deep enough to hide a house. Hitler was ecstatic. He patted Alfred Krupp on the back. The weapon worked. It was capable of smashing the Maginot Line. But there was a cruel twist of irony. By the time the Gustav was finally ready for combat in late 1941, the target it was built for, France, had already surrendered. The Maginot Line had been bypassed a year ago. The gun was a solution to a problem that no longer existed. The generals looked at the map. They had a 1,350-ton weapon with no target. It was too slow to hunt tanks. It was too clumsy to fight in the open field. But then, Operation Barbarossa began, the invasion of the Soviet Union. And down in the south, on the Black Sea, there was a city that the Germans could not crack, a city fortified with bunkers even stronger than the Maginot Line, Sevastopol. The engineers looked at the monster and smiled. It had a purpose again. They began the monumental task of disassembling the gun to ship it east. They were about to unleash the beast on the Russians. Winter, 1941. The order arrived from Berlin. Move the Gustav to Crimea. It sounds like a simple instruction. In any normal war, moving artillery meant hitching a cannon to a truck or a horse and driving to the front. But for the Schwerer Gustav, movement was a logistical nightmare that bordered on madness. The gun was not a vehicle. It was a structure. It couldn't just turn a key and drive. To move it, they had to destroy it. The disassembly process alone took weeks. The massive barrel was split in two. The carriage was broken down into sub-assemblies. The bogies were separated. The engineers at Krupp had designed the gun to be transported, but the scale of the convoy was staggering. When fully packed for travel, the Schwerer Gustav did not fit on one train. It required 25 separate freight trains. Imagine a convoy stretching for nearly a mile and a half. One train carried the barrel, another carried the breech block, others carried the ammunition, the cranes, the generators, and the specialized tools. But the gun didn't travel alone. It brought its own society with it. Assigned to the gun was the 672nd Heavy Artillery Battalion, E. This unit consisted of 420 men. Their only job in the war was to serve this one machine. There were gunners, mechanics, electricians, and rail specialists, but even they were not enough. To protect the gun from air attacks, the convoy included 2 entire flak battalions armed with anti-aircraft guns. They had to guard the train every inch of the way. If a single British bomber destroyed a bridge ahead of the convoy, the most expensive weapon in history would be stranded. Then there were the construction crews. Because the Gustav was so heavy, it couldn't travel on standard tracks without risk. A dedicated team of railway engineers traveled ahead of the train, reinforcing bridges and checking the ballast of the tracks to ensure the ground wouldn't collapse under the weight of the steel monster. In total, over 4,000 men were mobilized just to move one gun from Germany to Russia. It was a moving city, consuming tons of food and fuel every day, clogging up the supply lines that were desperately needed for the freezing soldiers on the front line. The journey to the Eastern Front was slow and painful. The train crawled across Poland and Ukraine, moving like a funeral procession. The gauge of the railway tracks in Russia was different from Germany, adding another layer of complexity. Finally, in early 1942, the convoy reached the Crimean Peninsula. The target was Sevastopol. Sevastopol was the most heavily fortified city in the world. The Soviets had spent decades turning it into an impregnable fortress. It was ringed by massive armored batteries with names like Stalin, Molotov, and Maxim Gorky. These forts had 305mm cannons protected by feet of concrete. The Germans had thrown everything they had at the city, Luftwaffe bombers, heavy mortars. But the forts held. The siege had dragged on for months. When the Gustav convoy arrived at the staging area in Bakhchisarai, about 30 kilometers north of the target, the real work began. You cannot just park the Gustav and shoot. You have to build the firing site. The German engineers surveyed the land. They needed a flat, stable plane to lay the specialized double-track curve. This was critical. The Gustav gun had no traverse mechanism. The barrel could only move up and down. It could not look left or right. To aim the gun horizontally, you had to move the entire 1,350-ton machine along a curved railway track. By pushing the gun forward or backward along the curve, the barrel would point at a different angle. To build this specialized track, the Germans forced 1,500 civilians and prisoners of war to dig day and night. They built a massive earth embankment to support the weight. They laid the 4 rails, 2 pairs, with geometric precision. Then, the reassembly began. It took 5 weeks to put the gun back together. 2 massive gantry cranes, specially designed for the task, had to be erected over the tracks. They lifted the barrel sections, the breech, and the carriage. It was like building a skyscraper in a mud field. While the engineers worked, the secret had to be kept. The Germans deployed smoke generator battalions to blanket the entire valley in artificial fog whenever Soviet reconnaissance planes flew over. Patrols of soldiers with dogs roamed the perimeter. No one was allowed near the site without special clearance. Inside the camp, the tension was building. The officers knew they had one chance. The barrel of the Gustav had a limited lifespan. The immense pressure of firing a 7-ton shell eroded the rifling inside the barrel. Krupp engineers estimated that the barrel would be worn out after only 48 shots. That was the limit. 48 shots to justify the millions of marks, the 4,000 men, and the years of labor. Every shell cost as much as a luxury car. Every miss would be a disaster. By June 5, 1942, the monster was ready. The massive barrel was elevated, pointing ominously toward the horizon. The loading crane hoisted the first 7-ton explosive shell. The propellant bags were rammed home. Major General Erich von Manstein, the commander of the siege, gave the order. The targets were marked on the map. The first target wasn't a ship. It wasn't a bunker. It was a psychological statement. They aimed the gun at the coastal battery Maxim Gorky Y. The crew cleared the area. The firing officer held the lanyard. The silence of the Crimean morning was about to be broken by the loudest man-made sound in history. The monster of Essen was awake. June 5, 1942. 06 hours. The sun was rising over the Crimean hills. The air was still cool. Around the massive steel beast at Bakhchisarai, the world went silent. The 4,000 men of the 672nd Heavy Artillery Battalion stopped their work. The anti-aircraft crews scanned the skies nervously, praying that no Soviet fighters would appear to interrupt the ritual. On the firing platform, the gun crews wore heavy protective gear. They shoved specialized earplugs deep into their canals. They were ordered to keep their mouths slightly open. The shockwave of the Gustav was known to rupture eardrums and cause internal bleeding if the pressure wasn't equalized. The firing officer raised his hand. The lanyard was pulled. Physics describes sound as a vibration, but what came out of the Schwerer Gustav wasn't a vibration. It was a physical blow. The report measured over 180 decibels. It shattered windows in villages 30 kilometers away. It knocked the breath out of men standing hundreds of meters back. The ground liquefied. From the muzzle of the 32-meter barrel, a ball of fire the size of a building erupted. Through the smoke, a dark shape screamed into the heavens. The projectile was a 7-ton armor-piercing shell. It didn't fly like a normal bullet. It climbed. It punched through the cloud layer. It kept climbing, reaching an altitude of 35,000 feet, entering the stratosphere. At the peak of its arc, the shell was flying higher than modern commercial airliners. For nearly 3 minutes, The shell was airborne. The German crews on the ground could do nothing but wait. They were throwing a Volkswagen bus across the horizon, blindly trusting mathematics. Downrange, in the fortress city of Sevastopol, the Soviet defenders heard a noise they had never heard before. Veterans described it not as a whistle, but as the sound of a freight train falling from the sky. A low, terrifying roar that grew louder and louder until it consumed the world. The first shells targeted the coastal batteries, but the accuracy was terrifying. The Gustav wasn't a scattergun, it was a sniper rifle the size of a cathedral. One shell landed near the Fort Stalin complex. The explosion was so massive, it created a crater that disrupted the tectonic plates of the local area. But the German commanders had a specific target in mind for the next volley, a target that was supposed to be untouchable. It was known as White Cliff, Severnaya Bay. This was the main ammunition depot for the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. The Russians knew that German bombers controlled the skies, so they had built this depot to be indestructible. It was located on the northern shore of Severnaya Bay. But it wasn't on the surface. The ammo bunkers were dug 30 meters underground, and to make them even safer, they were positioned underneath the water of the bay. The logic was sound. No bomb could punch through 30 meters of water, then 30 meters of solid rock, and then 10 meters of reinforced concrete. It was the safest place on Earth. The German firing officer adjusted the coordinates. The massive gun carriage groaned as it was pushed slightly along the curved track to adjust the azimuth. The barrel was elevated to 52 degrees. The loader rammed a special concrete-piercing shell into the breech. This shell had a delayed fuse. It was designed not to explode on impact, but to wait until it had burrowed deep into the target. Fire. The shell arced over the city. It descended at twice the speed of sound. When it hit the water of Severnaya Bay, it didn't stop. The kinetic energy of 7 tons moving at supersonic speed turned the water into steam. The shell punched through the bay, parting the sea like a solid steel needle. It slammed into the seabed. It drilled through 30 meters of limestone rock and earth in a fraction of a second. It hit the concrete roof of the secret bunker. It smashed through. And then, deep in the darkness of the subterranean vault, surrounded by thousands of tons of Soviet high explosives, the German fuse activated. The explosion that followed was registered as a seismic event. Observers on the surface saw the water of the bay boil and rise up. A massive column of water, mud, and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air. A mushroom cloud formed over the bay. The shockwave was so violent that a Soviet ship anchored in the harbor was lifted out of the water and thrown onto its side on the shore. The indestructible White Cliff ammo dump was gone, vaporized. Inside the city, the Soviet commanders stared at reports in disbelief. They couldn't understand what weapon could do this. They suspected a new type of massive aerial bomb, or perhaps sabotage. The idea that they were being shot at by a gun 30 kilometers away was too absurd to consider. Back at Bakhchisarai, the German crew cheered. But the celebration was short. The rate of fire was agonizingly slow. It took 45 minutes to reload the monster. The barrel had to be lowered to 0 degrees. The hoist had to lift the next shell. The propellant bags had to be stacked. The temperature of the barrel had to be checked. They managed to fire only 14 rounds that day. But each round was a catastrophe for the defenders. Fort Stalin was hit. Fort Molotov was hit. The Maxim Gorky battery, the pride of the Soviet defense with its twin 305mm turrets, was silenced. A single shell from the Gustav had cracked its concrete dome like an eggshell, jamming the turret and burying the crew. For 5 days, the bombardment continued. The monster ate through its barrel lining. With every shot, the steel rifling inside the gun was stripped away by the friction. The engineers measured the wear anxiously. They knew the gun was dying with every trigger pull. By June 17th, they had fired 48 shells. The barrel was worn out. The accuracy began to drift. But the job was done. Sevastopol, the fortress city, was a smoking ruin. The concrete forts were smashed. The ammunition was gone. The morale of the defenders was broken by the thunder of the invisible giant. The Schwerer Gustav had proven its point. It had done the impossible. It had sniped an underwater bunker from the stratosphere. But as the smoke cleared over the Crimea, The German High Command faced a new problem. They had won the battle, but they had worn out the only weapon capable of doing it. And now they had to move the 1,350-ton beast again, this time to a new target. A target far to the north, a city named Leningrad. July 4th, 1942. The siege of Sevastopol was over. After 250 days of brutal fighting, the fortress city had fallen. The Soviet defenders, starved and battered by the relentless bombardment, surrendered. The Schwerer Gustav had played its part. It had cracked the unbreakable forts. It had proven the concept. The engineers at Krupp popped champagne corks. But on the firing range at Bakhchisarai, the mood was less celebratory. The gun crews looked at their monster and realized it was sick. The massive 32-meter barrel was ruined. Every time the Gustav fired, the immense friction of the 7-ton shell and the explosive heat of the propellant stripped away layers of steel from the inside of the bore. The rifling, the spiral grooves that spin the shell for accuracy, was almost completely erased. The barrel had been shot out. Technically, the gun could still fire, but the shells would tumble in the air. Accuracy would be gone. A sniper rifle had turned into a musket. So before the gun could kill again, it needed a heart transplant. This wasn't like changing the barrel of a machine gun, which takes 5 seconds. This was an industrial operation. A spare barrel had to be shipped all the way from the Krupp factory in Essen, Germany, to the Crimea. It had to be transported on a specialized train across thousands of kilometers of partisan-infested territory. Meanwhile, the 4,000 men of the 672nd Battalion had to reverse the entire construction process. The massive gantry cranes were re-erected. The worn-out barrel was unbolted and lifted free. The new barrel was lowered into place. The tolerances were measured in millimeters. It was watchmaking on a scale of thousands of tons. Once the gun was refurbished, the question was, where next? Hitler looked at the map. In the south, victory was secured. But in the north, another city was defying him. Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad was one of the most horrific events in human history. The Germans had surrounded the city, cutting off all food. Millions of civilians were starving to death inside, but the city would not surrender. Hitler decided that starvation wasn't fast enough. He wanted to level Leningrad. He wanted the Gustav to do to Leningrad what it had done to Sevastopol. The order was given. Move the monster north. The logistical nightmare began all over again. The gun was dismantled. The 25 freight trains were loaded. The 4,000 men packed their kits. They began the long, slow crawl from the warm coast of the Black Sea to the freezing forests near the Baltic. It was a journey of nearly 2,000 kilometers across a war zone. The rail network was clogged. Trains carrying vital winter clothing and ammunition for the infantry were shunted onto side tracks to let the Gustav pass. The ego of the weapon was consuming the resources of the army. By late 1942, the convoy arrived at the station of Taizy, just 30 kilometers south of Leningrad. Once again, the circus performed its act. The slave laborers were brought in. The double-track curve was built. The embankment was raised. The anti-aircraft flak towers were constructed. The fog generators were positioned. The gun was reassembled. The new barrel pointed menacingly toward the spires of Leningrad. The crews calculated the firing coordinates. They had a target list: the shipyards, the power plants, the command bunkers. The beast was hungry. It was loaded. It was ready. But then the reality of war intervened. While the Germans were playing with their giant toy, the Soviets were fighting for survival. In January 1943, the Red Army launched Operation Iskra. It was a massive counter-offensive designed to break the siege of Leningrad. Soviet tanks and infantry smashed into the German lines. The front collapsed. The German commanders at Taizy panicked. The Schwerer Gustav was a weapon of offense, not defense. It had zero mobility. It couldn't turn to shoot at attacking tanks. It was a sitting duck. If the Soviets overran the station at Taizy, they would capture the secret weapon. It would be the greatest propaganda victory of the war. Stalin would put the Gustav on display in Red Square. The order came down from Berlin, screaming with urgency. Dismantle, retreat. Do not let the gun fall into enemy hands. The firing order was cancelled. The 4,000 men who had spent months traveling and weeks building the site now had to tear it all down in a frenzy of panic. The bolts were stripped, the barrel was lowered, the trains were loaded under the sound of approaching Soviet artillery. Not a single shot was fired at Leningrad. The millions of Reichsmarks, the thousands of man-hours, the train fuel, the logistics, it was all wasted. The Gustav was hauled away in disgrace, racing back towards Germany with its tail between its legs. This moment marked the turning point in the life of the weapon. At Sevastopol, it was a terrifying god of war. At Leningrad, it was a burden, a liability. The Germans began to realize that in a losing war, a weapon that takes 6 weeks to set up is not an asset. It is a trap. The monster was retreating. But the engineers at Krupp had one final desperate idea. If the gun was too heavy to move, why not make it move itself? They began to draw up plans for an even bigger monstrosity. A version of the Gustav on tank treads, the Landkreuzer P-1500 monster. A tank the size of a hotel. But for the Schwerer Gustav itself, the glory days were over. It was heading into the shadows, towards a mysterious end that would puzzle historians for decades. 1943, the tide of the war had turned. The German army was no longer the unstoppable force that swept across Europe. They were retreating from Russia. They were losing in North Africa. And in the skies above Germany, British and American bombers were turning industrial cities into rubble. In a secret depot near Chemnitz, the Schwerer Gustav sat in the dark. The wonder weapon was gathering dust. It had been built to smash fortresses, but now the Germans were the ones hiding in bunkers. The generals looked at the massive gun with disdain. It required 4,000 men to operate, yet it hadn't fired a shot in anger for over a year. The railway system it relied on was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing raids. A gun that needs a train is useless if the tracks are blown up. The engineers at Krupp faced a crisis. Their masterpiece was becoming obsolete. They needed to make it mobile, real mobility, not trains. They needed to take the 350-ton barrel and make it drive off-road. In the fevered minds of the Nazi leadership, specifically under the approval of Adolf Hitler, who loved gigantism, a new project was born. If the gun was too heavy for a train, they would build a tank to carry it. They called it the Landkreuzer P-1500 monster. This was not a tank in any conventional sense. It was a land battleship. The blueprints drawn up by Krupp were terrifying. The vehicle would weigh 1,500 tons. To put that in perspective, the heaviest tank actually used in the war, the King Tiger, weighed 70 tons. The monster would be 20 times heavier. It would be 42 meters long, 18 meters wide, 7 meters tall. To move this mountain of steel, standard engines were useless. The engineers planned to install 4 massive diesel engines taken directly from Type 7 U-boat submarines. The design called for tracks, but not just 2. The ground pressure of a 1,500-ton vehicle would liquefy the soil. It would sink to the center of the earth. So the engineers gave it 4 gigantic sets of caterpillar tracks, each one meters wide. It would have a crew of over 100 men operating inside the hull. It would carry its own smaller tanks on its back, just for defense against infantry. It was a mobile fortress designed to roam the Russian steppes, firing the 80-cm Gustav shells at will, without needing a railway crew to build tracks for weeks. Hitler was fascinated. He saw the P-1500 as the ultimate expression of German power. He imagined fleets of these land cruisers crushing the Soviet Union. But there was one man in the Nazi hierarchy who still had a grip on reality. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments. Speer looked at the blueprints and saw madness. He pointed out the obvious physics. There was no bridge in the world that could hold 2,500 tons. The monster could never cross a river. There was no road that could support it. As it drove, it would literally destroy the pavement behind it, leaving a trench of destruction. It couldn't drive through towns because it would crush the sewer systems and water pipes underground just by passing over them. And fuel. The monster would consume thousands of gallons of diesel per hour. Germany was already running out of fuel. The Luftwaffe was grounded because of shortages. Building a tank that drank fuel like a submarine was suicide. In late 1943, Speer officially cancelled the project. The P-1500 monster remained a paper nightmare, never to be built. This left the real Schwerer Gustav stranded. It was still tied to the rails, and now It was being hunted. The Allies had total air superiority. British Spitfires and American Mustangs roamed the skies over Germany, shooting at anything that moved. A train pulling a 32-meter-long gun was the biggest target in Europe. The Gustav became a fugitive in its own country. The 672nd Battalion spent their days playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek. They traveled only at night, moving the massive train from one tunnel to another. During the day, they hid the gun inside forests or camouflage sheds, terrified that a single P-47 Thunderbolt pilot would spot them. If a fighter bomber attacked the Gustav, it wouldn't need a heavy bomb. A simple strafing run with 50-caliber machine guns could ignite the propellant cars. The resulting explosion would be nuclear in scale. It would wipe out the gun, the crew, and the nearby town. The once proud city of soldiers that served the gun was reduced to a skeleton crew. The 4,000 men were desperately needed elsewhere. The infantry on the Eastern Front were screaming for reinforcements. Having thousands of able-bodied men babysitting a giant gun that wasn't shooting was criminal. Slowly, the unit was stripped. The flak battalions were sent to protect cities. The guards were sent to the front lines. The Gustav was left with just enough men to keep the grease fresh and the wheels turning. As 1944 approached, the Allied armies landed in Normandy. The Russians pushed into Poland. The walls were closing in on the Third Reich. The Schwerer Gustav was moved deeper and deeper into Germany, running out of track, running out of places to hide. The weapon that was built to conquer the world was now just trying to survive it. It had become a burden, a symbol of a failed philosophy, the belief that bigger is always better. But the story wasn't quite over. As the American army advanced into Bavaria, the Germans decided that if they couldn't use the gun, no one would. They prepared for the final act of the Gustav, its execution. April 1945. The 1,000-year Reich was burning. The Soviet Red Army was storming the streets of Berlin. In the west, the Americans and British were racing across the Rhine, capturing city after city. The German war machine had disintegrated into chaos. Deep in the forests of Bavaria, near the village of Metzenhof, a ghost train sat motionless on a hidden siding. It was the Schwerer Gustav. The crew was gone. The thousands of technicians, the anti-aircraft gunners, the rail engineers, they had all fled or been drafted into the infantry to die in the final defense of Germany. Only a skeleton crew of loyal officers and demolition experts remained. They had received their final order directly from Berlin. Destroy all secret weapons, leave nothing for the enemy. For the engineers who had spent 10 years of their lives designing, building, and caring for the Gustav, this was a funeral. They weren't just destroying a weapon, they were destroying the pinnacle of German engineering. But they knew the Americans were close. They could hear the rumble of Sherman tanks in the distance. On April 14, 1945, the execution began. They couldn't just throw a hand grenade into the barrel. The steel of the Gustav was so thick, so hardened, that standard explosives would just scratch the paint. They attached massive shaped charges to the breech block, the heart of the gun. They placed demolition charges inside the massive 32-meter barrel. They rigged the carriage with high explosives intended to snap the massive steel girders that held the monster together. The fuse was lit. The engineers ran into the forest for cover. The explosion was not a sharp crack. It was a deep, heaving roar that shook the trees for miles. The Schwerer Gustav, the largest weapon ever built by human hands, ripped itself apart. The barrel peeled open like a banana. The massive breech block, weighing hundreds of tons, was thrown into the air like a toy. The carriage collapsed onto the tracks, twisting the rails into pretzels. The monster was dead. A few days later, a reconnaissance unit of the U.S. Third Army was advancing through the forest. The American soldiers were used to seeing destroyed tanks and burnt-out trucks. But as they pushed through the pine trees near Grafenwöhr, they stopped dead in their tracks. Looming out of the mist was a wreckage of impossible proportions. It looked like a collapsed skyscraper lying sideways in the woods. The soldiers climbed over the twisted steel, dwarfed by the size of the components. They posed for photos standing inside the barrel, looking like children in a sewer pipe. The reports went back to HQ. We have found a railway gun, but it's bigger. Intelligence officers raced to the scene. They identified the wreckage. But then the mystery deepened. 50 kilometers away, near Auerswalde, Soviet troops found another wreckage. It was a second gun. Many people didn't know that Krupp had actually built two giants. The first was the Schwerer Gustav. The second was named Dora, named after the wife of the chief engineer. Dora had been deployed briefly to Stalingrad, but had been pulled back before it could fire, terrifyingly escaping capture. Now both sisters lay dead in the German mud. The Americans and the Soviets stared at the carcasses of these dinosaurs. They represented the end of an era, the era of gigantism. The Nazi philosophy was that if you built a tank big enough or a gun big enough, you would be invincible. The wreckage in the forest proved them wrong. The Gustav was a masterpiece of engineering, but a failure of strategy. It was destroyed not by a bigger gun, but by its own inability to move, to adapt, to survive in a modern war of speed and air power. The soldiers began to cut up the wreckage. The Americans took pieces for study. The Soviets took pieces to melt down. But the story didn't end in the forest. The physical guns were destroyed, but the idea of the Gustav survived. The technical data, the ballistics reports, and the men who built it were captured. And as the dust settled on World War II, a new war was beginning, the Cold War. And both the Americans and the Russians looked at the 80 shell and asked the same question. We can't fire this from a gun, but what if we put a rocket engine on the back of it? The technology of the Gustav was about to be reborn, not as artillery, but as the delivery system for a new weapon that would make the 7-ton shell look like a firecracker, the atomic bomb. In the summer of 1945, the wreckage of the Schwerer Gustav lay rusting in the Bavarian forest. It was a dinosaur carcass, picked clean by scavengers. The Americans and Soviets eventually cut the massive steel beams into scrap. The metal that had been forged to conquer Europe was melted down, likely recycled into cars, bridges, or toaster ovens in the rebuilding of Germany. The physical monster was gone. But its ghost lingered. As military analysts studied the weapon in the cold light of peace, they realized the terrifying inefficiency of Nazi engineering. Consider this comparison. The armor-piercing shell of the Schwerer Gustav weighed 7.1 tons. It required a 1,350-ton machine and 4,000 men to fire it. And when it hit, it destroyed a single bunker or a city block. 3 months after the Gustav was destroyed, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped a weapon over Hiroshima. That weapon, the atomic bomb Little Boy, weighed 4.4 tons, significantly less than a single Gustav shell. Yet that smaller bomb didn't destroy a bunker. It destroyed a city. The contrast killed the concept of the supergun instantly. Why spend millions building a railway monster that takes weeks to assemble, when a single airplane carrying a single bomb can end a war in an afternoon? The Schwerer Gustav was the peak of 19th century thinking pushed into the 20th century. It was the ultimate expression of kinetic energy, throwing a heavy rock very fast. But warfare had changed. It had moved from kinetic to chemical and nuclear energy. However, the dream of the supergun didn't die immediately. In the 1960s, a brilliant but controversial engineer named Gerald Bull became obsessed with the ballistics data of the Gustav. He believed that instead of firing shells at cities, a massive gun could fire satellites into space cheaply. He spent decades chasing this dream, eventually ending up in Iraq working for Saddam Hussein on Project Babylon, a supergun even larger than the Gustav, with a barrel 156 meters long. But history repeated itself. Just like the Gustav, Project Babylon was a static, clumsy target. Before it could be finished, Gerald Bull was assassinated, and the gun parts were destroyed. The lesson was learned again. Giant guns are traps. Today, the legacy of the Schwerer Gustav is not military but psychological. It stands as the ultimate monument to the Wunderwaffe, wonder weapon syndrome. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi leadership believed that engineering could overcome reality. They believed that if they built a tank big enough, the Maus, a jet fast enough, the Me-262, or a gun loud enough, the Gustav, they could cheat defeat. They were wrong. The Gustav was a masterpiece of metallurgy and ballistics. It worked exactly as designed. It hit its targets, it shattered records. But as a weapon of war, it was a failure. It consumed the resources of an entire army division to do the job of a squadron of cheap dive bombers. The tracks where the Gustav once rolled have long since been pulled up. The crater at Severnaya Bay has been filled by the sea. The forts of Sevastopol are museums, but if you visit the Military History Museum in Dresden or the Imperial War Museum in London, you can see the only surviving pieces of the monster, the massive shell casings. They stand upright, taller than a man, silent monoliths of steel. Visitors stand next to them looking up in awe, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the violence they represented. They are tombstones for an era of warfare that will never return. An era where size mattered more than speed. An era where 4,000 men devoted their lives to serving a single machine. The Schwerer Gustav was the biggest gun ever built. And unless humanity loses its mind again, it will remain the biggest forever. It was the impossible gun. A weapon that proved that just because you can build something doesn't mean you should.